Can London recover? I'm joined by the economist Vicky Price, the leader of Camden Conservatives Oliver Cooper, and the journalist and former editor of City Metric John Elledge. If you're following on Twitter, please use the hashtag #BrightBlue, and there will be a chance for you to ask questions through Slido. The link is on the YouTube channel, so please do send through your questions. So we'll start with Oliver. Camden, do you expect it to go back to normal, to pre-pandemic days, or do you actually sense there might be a shift in the way residents in your area live, work and travel?
So thank you very much. My internet connection seems to be unstable, so apologies if I cut out. But in many regards, Camden is a microcosm, despite that being strange to hear for people outside of zone 1, 2, 3. Camden's a microcosm in many ways of London as a whole, because it's got central London, it's got the internationally important, relevant and famous parts of its economy, of its destinations, its tourist attractions, etc. And it also has, like the place I've got behind me, Belsize Village, it's got a whole bunch of more suburban areas, places with more distinctive local characteristics. And therefore, as a result, if you're going to get places like Camden and by extension places like London back on their feet afterwards, you're going to need to leverage both of those things. You're going to have to accept the fact that in the internationally renowned central areas of London, you're going to have a drop off on people coming in every day. It's not going to be forever, but you are going to see quite a long tail of people not commuting in every day. You're going to have flexible working, where people might work 3 days, 4 days a week rather than 5. And therefore, as a consequence, you're going to have a reduction in spending in some of the local businesses there, as well as the internationally important office space there. And the question is how we pivot and how we move. Now, maybe we move back to a world in which some of those central locations have more housing, as used to be the case. Over most of the 20th century, central London depopulated, turned almost, excuse me, almost exclusively into office blocks and workspaces. And maybe that changes back. I think that might be a positive thing for making sure there's not this hyper cyclical approach to the fortunes of central London. Then places outside central London, what's called the central activity zone in Camden, that's south of Euston Road. 5/6 of Camden is north of Euston Road, which means you've got to have places like this behind me that are more local, more attractive. And it also means that you can't have a one-size-fits-all approach. Now, I started by saying Camden was a microcosm of London as a whole, but if you go to Havering, or you go to Harrow, or you go to Sutton, and you say that, they would laugh at me for saying it. But what they might recognise is the sense of place that's held by communities like the one that I represent in Hampstead. And again, something they might confront if they think they're being told they're the same as Hampstead. But the sense of place and the need to have really local-led approach to development, to future urban design, realm, economic renewal, and therefore the result is really key. And this will come on to, I think, what the others might talk about when it comes to the governance of London, making sure that boroughs are in the driving seat as well.
Okay, so Vicky, I mean, let's just talk about the economy. London has been very badly hit because obviously, you know, hospitality, retail, tourism has been, you know, shut down as a result of the pandemic. And certainly work that we've done at Bright Blue suggests universal credit claimants, the growth in those over the pandemic has been particularly pronounced in London. But do you think because of what London is and the kind of skilled people that are here, that it actually bounce back quite quickly? What's your assessment there?
Generally, what happens is if you are particularly badly hit and then because of restrictions, which is what we've seen, I mean, after all, London is quite strong in the area of accommodation and food and administrative services or support services and the service activities generally, then once those open up, then you bounce back considerably faster than others. So there is hope that this is going to happen. It is absolutely true that unemployment rate in London, by comparison to what happens elsewhere in the UK, has been much higher. So although overall we have an unemployment rate of 5%, in London it's perceived to be statistically about 6.5%, but the reality is there's a lot of hidden unemployment out there. In fact, it's very surprising that it isn't slightly better in terms of how London has done, given that quite a lot of migrants have left. So what we've seen is particularly EU migrants, if we want to call them migrants, or people from the EU who are working here, who've either gone back because of Brexit, or had decided to go and work somewhere else for a while, or even work from their original places of birth, where they have houses. So we've seen quite a lot of workers, seriously remote workers right now. So people working in other countries, not just working from home, but working elsewhere and still contributing to the economy. So London has been badly hit, surprisingly even worse than perhaps we would have forecast, given that the population, the working population, has been reduced a little bit because of this, and quite a lot of people have exited the labour force anyway, which includes women, of course, who've been rather badly hit by all this because of the extra stress, schools closing down, and so on. So what can we look forward to? The economy will be recovering. Already we have seen that retail sales are beginning to pick up. We saw some good figures for February. For the economy as a whole, what we've seen is that manufacturing has been on an upward trend continuously since the summer. It fell back a little bit in January, but that was because of Brexit in a way, the end of the transition period. There had been an awful lot of stock building that took place just before. Everyone worried we might end up with no deal Brexit. So there was a lot of activity of that type in December and also earlier in November, despite the lockdowns, but then it's picked up again. So what we're seeing is that after a fall in GDP in January, which of course would have affected London particularly because again, we had lockdowns, all the service sectors closing again. What we've seen is that at least manufacturing, of which London does a fair amount, and construction, again, of which London does a fair amount, have all been picking up again. And in fact, we had some PMI data for March, which are really rather strong. Hopefully that will filter down to the London economy as well. There are two concerns that I have. Actually, there are probably loads, but I think I'll just look at two. One of them is of course, the whole government attitude towards levelling up. What the Centre for Cities has discovered, and I'm sure lots of others have said similar things, is that the cost of levelling up now in the various regions which have been affected by COVID is considerably greater than we had expected. In fact, the cost is estimated being 4 times as high. So a lot of money will need to go to those regions if we are indeed to have the levelling up that's needed. Is that going to mean, therefore, that there's a lot less money that is available for London? And we've seen the problems with TfL and everything else in London, which might make London less attractive. The second thing is what happens to all those high-skilled workers that were mentioned before because of the inability to reach an agreement on Brexit and post-Brexit financial services and all the other services around it, which will be a real issue. And if I may then finally add a third, on this bounce back that we're all expecting for the UK as a whole, but particularly for London, does depend crucially on the areas that I mentioned before, such as accommodation, food, hospitality, entertainment, recovering. And we've just had an announcement this morning about what the new travel routes are going to be, where you can come in easily. But there are serious concerns that if we don't get the export trade of tourism, if we don't get all those venues again being able to operate, if we need vaccine passports in order to enter any sort of retail store in the future, although hopefully that isn't going to happen, but loads of entertainment, that would be a problem.
I'm just going to bring John in. So it looks likely that Sadiq is going to win another mayoral term. Does he deserve to, do you think?
Okay, I'm going to choose. I was really looking forward to having a moment to attack Sean Bailey. You've wrong-footed me there, Ryan. I do not think his achievements are as glittering as one might have hoped back in those glory days of May 2016. There's the bus hop affair is one of the few solid achievements I actually point to. I remember speaking to one of his advisors quite early on in that term and about housing, and the line was, "We are hoping that by the end of the term we will be turning the tanker." I am not sure, looking at the London housing market as it is, that you would say the tanker has been turned, and that is obviously the biggest policy problem facing London government. But to be fair, these have been incredibly unpredictable times. And just 6 weeks, I think, after Sadiq was first elected, the referendum happened. and Brexit began, since when we've had 3 years of political chaos followed by a pandemic. So I think there is possibly some excuse there, but I would hope that we will see more solid achievements from Sadiq in his second term, which feels pretty much inevitable. If you look at the polls at the moment, one this week in the Evening Standard suggests that Khan is running on 47% to Sean Bailey's 26%. If that was to hold up, that would be the worst result for a Tory candidate in any London mayoral election to date, including the 2001, in which the vote was effectively split 3 ways between a Labour candidate, Tory candidate, and Ken Livingstone. So that would not be a great result for Sean Bailey or the Conservative Party in London. But I think there is an argument that actually, as you hinted, maybe Sadiq Khan's achievements in office are not that strong. There's some polling out from the Centre for Cities today, which suggests that actually a lot of Londoners have been disappointed with Sadiq Khan in one way or another. And I kind of think if the Tory party had nominated a stronger candidate, might not have won, but there would have at least been some kind of tension, which is entirely lacking in the race that we're in at the moment.
Is that right, Oliver? Do you think, is Sean Bailey the best possible candidate for the Tories?
I mean, 2.5 years on from him having been selected, I'm not sure it's a helpful question to ask in many ways. I think I agree with the analysis that John just presented on Sadiq Khan's record, which even, obviously I'm not a Labour councillor, but even my Labour colleagues and Labour friends will say has been disappointing on policy. I think it's right that that's discussed from a accountability point of view. I think it's sensible to discuss policy in elections, but I completely understand that this discussion has been more about personality, and I think that's almost an inevitable consequence of the presidential style elections that London has in the mayoralty, in a way that you don't have in local council elections, but you increasingly have at national level. So, we thought, I think back in 2000, when it was constructed, that it wouldn't be this sort of presidential election in that sense, because of the experience that happened under Ken Livingstone when they were in the GLC. They didn't want to create this tension between national government and London government. But because of the way it's constructed, you do end up with very strong personalities. And Sadiq Khan has that very strong personality. So I think that more than anything is why Sadiq Khan is in the place he is in polls.
I mean, John, do you buy this, that it actually is a bit of a personality contest? It isn't really about delivery. I mean, Boris was a very kind of big character. Is that why he won London rather than, a kind of record delivery?
I'm trying to think back to, even if we think back to the 2008-2012 term, I think actually even fans of the Prime Minister would probably admit that the solid policy achievements from that mayoral term, from Boris Johnson's first mayoral term, were pretty few and far between. It was only later on in his mayoralty, when Eddie Lister took over as Chief of Staff, that the actual solid things started to be delivered that weren't hangovers from the Ken Livingstone mayoralty. I think it's certainly true that the structure of a mayoral race does mean it attracts these big personalities, these big characters. And Ken Livingstone and Boris Johnson certainly, Sadiq Khan, I think, was not seen as one until he had the post. He's kind of been sort of transmuted into one by having it. But I think it's certainly true that because it is such a personal mandate, and also because, frankly, by international standards, London's mayoralty is not a strong institution. The mayor of London
actually. Yeah, I mean, that's interesting.
New York or the mayor of Paris. But a lot of what they can achieve is done more through the bully pulpit function of just agitating and advocating for stuff, rather than the ability to kind of legislate or raise taxes or something. So actually, I think there is an argument that it's not the worst thing in the world to attract these big personalities. That is kind of how you sort of attract attention to London's needs.
Right, okay. I want to pick up on that and ask Vicky, just in the context of economic recovery. I mean, what can a mayor do really to help London with its bounce back? What can it do? What can they do? What should they do? I mean, is it that they're quite constrained with the powers that they have?
Well, they're hugely constrained, and there is a problem, of course, that we have a a London mayor who is of a different party. And of course, we've seen what happened when Boris Johnson ceased being that. And then, of course, a lot of the money coming from the Treasury was cut back. So quite a lot of the issues that TfL that I mentioned earlier is having is because of that. So there is an issue of how much funding is coming into London. But, there are a few controls that of course, Sadiq Khan has in terms of perhaps possibly rearranging transport around London, making it cleaner and all that sort of stuff. But in terms of being able to do anything major, I mean, Crossrail was, of course, funded by an extra business rate tax, so a sort of supplementary business rate. Well, firms right now are screaming about business rates anyway, the sort of standard business rate that they have to pay. And of course, there is a business rates holiday. Now, the ability for any mayor to raise funding to do anything major in London is hugely restricted. So I'm afraid it is an issue. The question, until things change from that point of view, then again, whatever Sadiq Khan or his successor, if there is such a thing, can do is going to be terribly constrained, I'm afraid.
So Oliver, just on this point around levelling up, which Vicky mentioned, I mean, it does seem to be that levelling up is about focusing resources and attention on areas outside of London. Do you worry that the Conservative Party is neglecting London and that there are economic and political consequences from doing so?
I challenge the opening sort of assumption and lemma there. I'm not sure it's necessarily about London versus non-London. There are incredibly poor parts of London that need and get support to different degrees under some of those programs. And there are lots of very wealthy places outside London that have not been chosen for levelling up. I grew up in Hertfordshire and Buckinghamshire, though Chorleywood and Amersham are not getting a significant amount of funding under the levelling up formula. But you're right that it presents a challenge to London's place and sense of identity, that the previous taps, which have always been turned on more for London than elsewhere, are now being readjusted slightly. Because, of course, the last thing that anyone really wants or needs right now is the goose that lays the golden egg for the whole United Kingdom, which is London and the South East presently, to be killed off. And one of the ways that it can be killed off is if our political discussion and what London and what is needed is focused on what is needed outside London. Now, London is only whatever it is, 14% of the UK. It's understandable the conversation is not dominated by London, but also when we talk about bouncing back, we've got to make sure that if some of the policies need to be different nationally within the M25, within Greater London than outside, then they are different. And that's something the government needs to be keenly aware of. And only by doing that, really, can there be a differentiation to make sure the different market conditions, the different housing conditions, the different conservation conditions that go with that, transport, all of those are considered separately. Because, as I said, if you take a one-size-fits-all approach to very different places, you're going to get the wrong outcomes, at least in one place.
So, John, when we talk about inequality broadly and crudely, the right always say you don't have to bring anyone down. It's about bringing others up. Whereas the left say actually it's about relativity, and people right at the top will have to sacrifice stuff to come down to create less inequality. So let's take that argument to regional inequality. Is it, if you want to level up, does that mean that London has to be hampered, it has to be hindered, it has to be stopped in some way? And is that indeed possible? Can politicians do that?
I feel I'm slightly out on a limb here because I'm not an economist. I don't know. My instinct is the problem is not that London's economy has shot away into the stratosphere. It's more one priority and visibility. It's that all our national debate is focused on the needs of the capital. We do tend, that's been slightly corrected since Brexit and red wall and all that, but it still kind of feels like that's very much something we talk about rather than something we actually deliver. If you actually look in terms of, the example I always come back to is a couple of summers ago, a mall just outside Manchester was on fire for about a month and a half and nobody in London noticed. It's on the most basic level stuff that happens outside London doesn't get the attention to it. And that also applies to things like the infrastructure investment. It is much easier for politicians in Westminster or civil servants in Whitehall to instinctively grasp the point of Crossrail than is to grasp why Leeds Bradford might need a metro system. So I do not think the problem is that London is too rich that's holding the rest of the economy down. I think the problem is more that because everything in this economy, everything in this government is based in London, so it kind of sucks all the attention. I suppose you could maybe argue that because London, we also have this internal brain drain that people leave cities in the north to get a university in the south or get a job in London and then don't tend to move back. So on that level, I think you could argue that maybe London's prosperity is a problem for the rest of the country. But my instinct is that actually it's not so much about hobbling London, it's more about making up that infrastructure investment deficit in so many of the other great cities in this country.
Great. I'm going to bring some of the audience in. There are some people out there watching. Vicky, I'll probably come to you with this first question. It's from a chap called Richard, who says, given that central government largely controls London's budget, which potentially leads to gridlock, should we move to local income taxes and business rates?
I think that would be a very good idea. But of course, what would then happen, and we need to bear that in mind, is that the areas that are poorer will not be able to raise anything like as much. So there's going to have to be some redistribution taking place still. And that's a big issue. We've seen that, of course, in the increase in council taxes, which are the ones that are able to really raise quite a lot of money, and which local authorities have not been able to do so very much because they don't have the richness around them to do that. So that immediately, if you have a lot of decentralization taking place, might solidify those inequalities that already exist, and that's the real problem. So you're probably going to need a hybrid system anyway, so that you can have that redistribution happening. So it doesn't necessarily solve the problem completely.
And Oliver, I mean, as a councillor, I know a lot of councillors say, give us more powers, but what about more responsibilities in terms of tax raising powers? Is that something that you would welcome?
I would personally welcome that being applied across the country, not just in London. I think you do have difficulties that are political as well as the economic ones and social ones that Vicky just outlined. We've seen a huge amount of movement in terms of local government funding and regional funding in London move away from a block grant from central government to being devolution and retention of business rates. However, when that's happened, you still see these graphs of doom that are presented in the public budgets or reports of local authorities, of TfL, saying, well, our grant's been cut. It has, but it's been replaced like for like, pound for pound, with business rates, which if they'd expanded in line with expectations and forecasts would put you in a better position. So just despite the fact that that's happened, there's been criticism and opposition to that process. I think that's a consequence politically of not having had a national conversation about where we are on devolution of powers and responsibilities, and that's not been had because having it has the complexity of the rebalancing and redistribution element. So provided we have that conversation, I think local authorities and regional authorities like London, the Metro Mayors, etc., can be given those greater powers. But until that conversation's had, I think people will misunderstand it, rightly, because it's a complex area, and that will leave no one better off.
I've got a question now from Andrew, who says, after the pandemic, how will London's labour market be impacted by migration and a move to remote working? So, a lot of people criticise London for being a global city. Well, some people welcome that. Some people criticise it for being too global and disconnected. Is it about to become even more global as a result of the shifts to remote working? Vicky, what do you think to that?
I did touch on that earlier, and I said that yes, we've already seen quite a lot of that happening. And it's interesting when you look at the advertisements for jobs, and they are recovering. We've seen that in London as well happening. We've seen that everywhere, and the latest LCCI, the Chamber of Commerce reports suggest that as well. There's the quarterly survey that they do, including some improvement in confidence. But the number of jobs that are now being advertised as remote working have gone up 4 times, so in the latest round. So there is going to be, certainly in my view, this retreat, if you like, from office working, but also a lot of the expansion may not be, let's hire someone who can come into our office, let's hire someone remote. I have some concerns about that in terms of what it will mean for conditions for people who work. And one of the problems that we have seen, of course, with this remote working is that not everyone has been able to do it. Huge inequality. And I think London is going to reflect that, particularly given that we rely so much on the service sector, hospitality and so on that I mentioned before, and tourists coming in, a lot of face-to-face. It is that the evidence suggests that the more you get paid, the more likely it is that you have been able through the pandemic to do your jobs or a particular, quite a large percentage of your tasks from home. And the less you get paid, the less likely you are to have been able to do that, which means that those who have been able to carry on have continued to be paid or furloughed. Those who have not been able to carry on have either been exposed to, let's say, there's a health risk if they work in the public health sector, or have lost their jobs completely and have not been supported by any of the furlough schemes except universal credit. So my worry is that we're going to come out of it with this mix of a lot of working from home, more global London, if you like, but with a huge inequality that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, well, we've got some research coming out actually just on the inequalities from working from home, sort of, acknowledging some of the benefits, but also looking at the inequalities that might emerge as a result of that. So watch out for that. Finally, a question I've got from Jag, which I might direct to John, which is, how will COVID impact London's environment? Less commuting, but potentially longer commutes as more people move out of the city. What's the net impact of COVID and the trends from it on this environment in the city?
I mean, I kind of think there's a big question mark here. That there's been some research in PwC, I think, suggesting that London's population might have fallen by 300,000 as a result of the pandemic. Which obviously has a huge knock-on effect on not only the economy, but the housing market and things like the environment and the city's carbon footprint. But we don't know. We at this point, I feel like we literally do not know the extent to which, if it turns out most businesses are going to switch to a home working model in which people only need to come into the office for a day or two a week, we might see far more people deciding they want a nice place by the seaside with a garden rather than a shoebox in zone 2. But then again, perhaps in 18 months' time, everything is much more back to normal. We'll talk of home working revolution will have gone away, as so many things do. And I feel like at this point that question is unanswerable because we don't know the extent to which the pandemic is going to upend anything. I would say that one slightly perverse effect of the green belt is that it has in some ways increased the carbon footprint of London's commuter zone, because it's for so many people who, instead of living on the outskirts of zone 6 to get a home, they now have to go to Chelmsford or Milton Keynes, these places out beyond the green belt where you can still build homes. So one side effect of that has been to force longer commutes and worse carbon footprints, which is not ideal, I think.
Oliver, I might just come to you for final words, which is, obviously there's growing concern nationally, but particularly in London, about climate and the environment. And it just seems there's a shift towards increased pedestrianisation, trying to discourage car use, expansion of clean air zones. Is that something that you broadly agree with?
It needs to be in particular places where it works. It needs to be evidence-led. I think John was right in saying there's a double-edged sword sometimes to some of these things. I think when it actually comes to London's CO2 emissions are overwhelmingly from gas boilers. About 60%, 65% in Camden are from commercial and residential gas boilers. Only about 19% is from transport of all sorts. So if we're trying to get the balance right, maybe it's not actually about transport, because of course, if we're moving to electric vehicles and they're powered by renewable energy, the balance changes. It's about thinking about these green issues and looking at the solutions that are going to reduce the CO2 by the most, rather than get the most headlines. I'm not sure that's necessarily transport, but I think it is on gas boilers, which is slightly less sexy.
Great. Well, thank you, Vicky, Oliver, John, for joining us. And thank you, everyone who's watching at home. Thank you for watching Bright Blue TV. Have a good afternoon.